this question of how to explain what psychoanalysis is. It's an interesting one. It's one of the reasons why psychoanalysis can't enter into psychology, or doesn't, or has been banned from it, because you can't regiment it, you can't order it, you can't make an exact schema, a rule book of it. I mean, how do other analysts work? No one really knows, except for the patient and the analysand and the analyst. And certainly the analyst is oblivious to how he works a lot of the time. I can make a guess of how many analysts and therapists work after going to a great number of them throughout my life. And most of them are quite, boring and regimented. And people like to make prescriptions for how an analyst or a therapist behave, conduct their sessions, the practice, how the practice relates to theory, if and when it does. How do analysts work? I don't really know. I know that I work actively. I know that other analysts, by hearing that, it might freak them out. But I, for example, the Lacanians in general do what they want to do during sessions, whatever it takes to put someone at ease, free association, but also because it's not about the kind of therapeutic one-on-one listening that we are so accustomed to thinking about in our therapy-saturated cliche culture. See, for me, for example, walking around, especially since I do a lot of work on Skype, is essentially a new kind of, it's like free association. It eases free association in the same way. I'm using it the same way that Freud used the couch, That's how I choose to use walking around during therapy sessions, doing whatever. But it's like when you're having a talk with someone about the most important issues, you are going to act whatever way it engages the thought process of that person. So one thing that prompted me to make a video again was as a sort of response to a wonderful little workshop that I virtually joined in on by a friend, Scott Vaughn. He runs this organization, Analytica, a very good one in New York. And it was about Jungian analysis and the futures for Jung. They never brought up what I think why Jung is really destined for a comeback right now is actually because hardcore biology actually is reminding us that we need to think in this way. That is to say that there are parts of our brain that are millions and millions of years old, and what is our issue to think that we are smarter than those parts of our brain that are millions of years old. Those parts of our brain which also manifest as mind, manifest as thought, and how you experience the world. And I saw my friend, my colleague Scott, get a little bit nervous about how the Jungian analysts essentially, project these sort of mythological stories onto people's recantations of their life experiences, memories, or dreams. Because he's a Lacanian like me, and so we try to avoid these kind of mythological storytelling aspects of life. But you shouldn't be so quick to do that, right? And even, essentially, that's what biology is telling us. New findings in neurobiology. And psychoanalysts, that's one of your jobs also, is to listen to that kind of thing, by the way. So, but see, he wanted to essentially negate the deeper story. For example, Scott recanted a dream essentially where he was in a restaurant and the host brought him to a vexing little question, and it was his life had repeated this encounter in the restaurant. And one of the Jungian analysts, actually, he never even got to ask this, but I'm doing it to make a point, was going to ask, was it a host or a hostess, male or female? And I think Scott they never even got there, but he inadvertently, was saying that was about to say, it's irrelevant and doesn't matter. But for example, what if it really does matter whether it's a host or a hostess? And it's not just a postmodern construction of their identity, right? What if your brain, it does, by the way, register that it's a male or a female? That actually does play a role of how this encounter went about, or how you remember it being about, or how it is dreamt about. Because it works not only on your current state of being and your contemporary intellectual knowledge, it also works on a brain and a historical mind that is millions and millions of years old. And so that would be point one, is like, why did they not catch that? The deep historical, dare I say, biological workings of the brain and of the mind are there, as well as the linguistic, conceptual, contextual, symbolic world that the Lacanians would adhere to and stick to. So that is to say, yes, analysis is not just about interpreting. And in fact, I would say you never interpret. It's the analysand who does the interpreting. But anyway, people still think that about psychoanalysts, and there are still a lot of, it is like a dying thing, right? So there's a lot of old fogey psychoanalysts who do still do the orthodox interpreting. But psychoanalysis is not about interpreting. But, any good philosophical thinker will, of course, notice that, of course, it's about interpreting. Because you're listening to someone else's language and you can't ever get one-to-one adherence to meaning. It's always an interpretation. But nonetheless, it's not just an interpretation. Because things are not mere images, as the symbolic world of language, as we recount them, as our memories replay them, would like to think. The world is also real. So, for example, that wasn't just a host or hostess in reality, in his recantation of reality, in his memory of reality, or in the dream. It also had something of the real. It was also a real person. It was a male or female. And so this is why psychoanalysts cannot only merely not interpret, but also to recognize that reality actually exists, and it's not just mere figments of our imagination, as Lacanians might think. And so, if you go on these mythological observation quests that someone like the Jungians would do, it does seem like it's excessively mythical, excessively, almost spiritual or religious. But it can also be seen as more of a hard way to get at what's really going on and how your mind works. That predicates a majority of your life and the mistakes you get yourself into and so forth. So, analysts shouldn't interpret too much, but interpretation to something which can be seen as so significant as to be archetypal is not merely illusory, is not merely fairy tale stuff. It has very real life practical applications for how one ends up conducting or does conduct their life. And it's likely historically, biologically, linearly processed in your mind and through the history of your man itself. Analysts stay silent most of the time, not because they don't have something to say, though I'm sure some of them don't have things to say, but because it's a process of just sitting in silence and waiting for a history, right? Psychoanalysts don't promise quick fixes because quick fixes are cheap. Why? Because even real medicine, but any sort of therapeutic endeavor involves taking case histories. Psychoanalysis deals with your life, so it is essentially a history of many, many case histories. You cannot take down your life in a session or 10 sessions. It takes a while to really make a case history. And you must look at the past, the deep past, and the very, very, very deep past, meaning millions of years of biology that you're connected to. This way is why the analyst is also, the real analyst is a non-listening person, right? We don't pretend to make these fake things that we're closely listening. Yes, we are closely listening, but we are really just receiving your case history. We're not close listening in the sense of sympathy. But we are really paying attention. It's not listening. Just letting it be absorbed into your mind as one of your own stories. It's why you have to have two people in analysis and one who essentially does nothing, right? The analyst essentially does nothing, but he waits patiently until he can punctuate or highlight an aspect of life that is so clear because it's been repeated so many times in these case histories that they can make essentially an objective statement. And often, hopefully, but not necessarily, hopefully, but and not even necessarily that the analysand, the patient, hadn't recognized yet, or fails to recognize a lot, fails to remember. So, I do hope to come back to this topic of the how contemporary biology essentially reinvigorates Jung, which was cast aside for so long. And also because Jung dealt more with psychosis, and the world is essentially becoming more autistic, becoming more psychotic in how we relate to each other. But I suppose most of all, to go full circle of how I started this session is, how do other analysts work? Well, they all work differently, and they work flexibly, and it's why, at least if you're with thinking good analyst, that it can't be easily theorized. And it's also very hard. It's why most psychoanalysts don't write their own standard editions. It's great if you do. Of course, it's also a bit of my own propagating to say that as analysts today, you should be both more active and both non-receptive at the same time, because it follows the mediums of the day. Be flexible, be active, but never prescriptive, unless it's essentially blaringly obviously there to the point of almost being objective. Because psychoanalysis is not a science, but it always has that aim as its intention. Thank you.